Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Rebecca Markert, Legal Director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation here in our studio in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Liz Cavell, Associate Counsel at FFRF. Rebecca and I are both attorneys at FFRF. We spend most of our days fighting to keep state and church separate. That is one of FFRF's purposes. Today, we're going to shift gears and talk about a topic related to FFRF's second purpose, which is educating about non-theism. We're going to talk about grieving without God. And as always, if you have questions for our guests or for us, you can type them into the Facebook comments, or you can email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org.
Before we begin, we want to address what happened in Texas this morning regarding abortion rights. At midnight, SB 8 went into effect in the state of Texas. This law prohibits abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy before many women even know or realize that they're pregnant. This type of heartbeat ban isn't new. It is passed in many state legislatures across the country, but it never survives a legal challenge because it's unconstitutional. Nevertheless, seizing on an opportunity with a new federal bench, Texas passed this law and added something equally horrifying. SB 8 allows private individuals to sue anyone who provides or assists in providing an abortion. It incentivizes those lawsuits through a sort of bounty system. So if you are successful in your lawsuit against these providers, you are able to receive $10,000 and attorney's fees.
Yikes. So opponents of this bill had asked the U.S. Supreme Court earlier this week to block the law from going into effect on September 1 while it's litigated. The Supreme Court had 2 days to decide the fate of the law, and last night they did nothing. So that means this morning millions of Texans woke up to abortion being effectively illegal in their state. So while we slept, Roe versus Wade was effectively overruled by the Supreme Court in Texas. And make no mistake, this law was religiously motivated. It was upheld by Christian nationalist activists and judges who've been waiting for this moment. Many of these judges were selected precisely for this moment. And the inaction of the court last night speaks volumes about where we're going. This upcoming term, the court is set to hear arguments in a case involving Mississippi's ban on abortions after 15 weeks. FFRF will be filing an amicus brief in that case. So the fight is not over. Litigation will continue over the Texas law and that law in Mississippi and many others like it.
As we mentioned, these bans have nothing to do with science. They are rooted in religion. Christian anti-abortion groups across the country are instrumental in crafting these laws. These bans are also a result of a weakened wall of separation between state and church. If you care about reproductive rights, you also need to care about state-church separation, and vice versa. Blocking abortion is just one part of the Christian nationalist agenda to dismantle the wall entirely and to impose their beliefs on us all. Abortion is health care, it's a constitutional right, and as Ann Gaylor, FFRF's founder, said, abortion is a blessing. It is also a state church issue. FFRF has been in this fight for reproductive freedom since its inception, and we will continue to stand with our partners in ensuring these constitutional rights are upheld. So, many of us woke up this morning and wondered, well, what can we do now? So, here we go. Support those who are already working to keep those abortion rights. Go to needabortion.org to find out how you can support abortion funds going to critical work in Texas.
You can support the Women's Medical Fund. FFRF's founder, Ann Gaylor, also founded this organization. It helps to fund abortions for low-income women in our home state of Wisconsin. That's wmfwisconsin.org.
You want to call your legislators. Let them know how you feel about abortion rights, whether they agree with you or not. Now's not the time to be silent or to avoid those who disagree with you.
And of course, vote in every election at every level. Your participation in protecting our freedoms is critical to guaranteeing those rights for future generations.
Also support court reform. Our courts are broken. They've been packed with Christian nationalist judges who are transforming our constitutional rights, and their work that they do will take generations to undo. We need to reform the Supreme Court and the entire federal judiciary. Call your representatives in Congress and tell them to act now.
And finally, of course, join FFRF. We need your support now more than ever to fight against Christian nationalists and to protect true religious freedom for all.
And now we're going to turn back to our topic of the day, grieving without God. There are many different types of grief. There's loss of a relationship, a plan for your career, loss of fundamental rights for women in Texas, things like that. But today, we'll be focusing on grief related to the death of a loved one. If you have questions about our topic, you can ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org.
So we've asked two amazing women to join us for our discussion today. We're going to be chatting with Peggy Johnson. She works for the Compassionate Friends, an organization that supports families who've lost a child. In 1992, after adopting two children, Peggy resigned as a director with Bell Atlantic Telephone Company to devote herself full-time to motherhood. In 2009, her son, Jordan, her oldest child, died at the age of 19 by suicide. After her son's death, she learned about TCF and she received support that she desperately needed at the time. She served as editor for TCF's magazines, and she's an avid writer, frequent contributor to the organization's magazine, We Need Not Walk Alone. She's been a workshop presenter at national conferences annually since 2013, and this summer, one of her presentations at the national conference was entitled, Healing When Faith is Not an Option. She and her husband live in Charlottesville, Virginia. Welcome and thank you, Peggy.
Thank you for having me.
And we will also be talking to Rebecca Hensler, founder of Grief Beyond Belief. Following the death of her infant son, Jude, Rebecca discovered that most of the online grief support groups are dominated by religion and spiritualism. She felt alienated by talk of angels, heavens, and signs, so she conceived an alternative free of mythology and mysticism. In 2011, Rebecca founded Grief Beyond Belief, a popular Facebook page for our non-religious community devoted to faith-free grief support. She's also published a book called The Secular Grief Support Handbook. She is a school counselor with a BA in political activism and an MS in counseling. She currently lives in the Bay Area with her wife and works at a public middle school in San Francisco. Welcome and thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, especially with Peggy.
Yeah, so we want to start first by just discussing your losses. Tell us about your sons.
You want to start, Peggy?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Peggy. Tell us about your son.
I lost my son, Jordan. It's been 12 years. He was 19 years old. He was after 5 years of infertility treatment and a year trying to adopt, I think when that infant was placed in my arms, my whole world revolved around him, and that really never stopped. He was a big guy. He was over 6 feet tall. He wore size 13 shoes. You can see here, this is with my neighborhood of younger children. He was kind of a Pied Piper. All the younger guys really enjoyed hanging out with him. And he was a Star Wars fan and a James Bond fan and loved the game of Halo, and we miss him very much.
It's kind of interesting in some ways, the similarities between Peggy's stories and mine. I had been actually told that I could never have a baby without, thousands of dollars of fertility treatment. But I was actually able to get pregnant and then very soon after I learned I was pregnant, I found out that my son Jude was developing in utero with a condition that would lead to pretty severe heart defects and undersized lungs. He was born on June 9th in 2009, and he was a beautiful little guy. He was in the NICU here in San Francisco, and we had 3 amazing months with him. He was this funny little baby. He was fussy, and he was opinionated. You could tell he loved Pink Floyd songs, but he, I mean, like he had particular things that were his things. He liked to hold hands, which is really a lot of the affection you can show a baby when he's in the hospital. The doctors and science gave him the absolute best chance they could, but his lungs weren't able to develop enough to support his growing body. And he died actually this week in 2009, which was 12 years ago. And I actually, as well as Peggy, sought grief support through the Compassionate Friends. And it was my experience at the Compassionate Friends, both the good, which was this really immediate grief support that was so valuable, and the challenges, which were that it was so alienating, is what led to founding Grief Beyond Belief.
So one of the reasons I think we wanted to do this show is because grief is going to affect everyone. One of my favorite authors on the subject talks about how at some point everybody's going to be in the front row of a funeral. I know that Liz and I both have experienced excruciating loss too. I lost my daughter, my first child, in 2010 to stillbirth, and Liz.
Yeah, I lost my mom at the age of 63 last year in 2020. After a, whirlwind 6-week, I won't say battle, but just, annihilation by lung cancer. So it was a very quick thing, and the loss of a parent is never easy. And so we've had grief.
So I think that talking about grief is important just as a society to sort of normalize the experience, because it is such an isolating experience for people. And then particularly for the non-religious community, I think it's a really important topic because as Peggy and Rebecca have pointed out, when you're already sort of in a minority community like being atheist or agnostic, being in an isolating experience can feel even more overwhelming, and you can feel more alone. So I want to kind of dial it back and just kind of talk about your non-belief and talk about when that evolved. Hollywood can portray atheists as really sort of angry people who don't believe in God because something terrible happened to them, and oftentimes it's because they've had experienced the death of a loved one, particularly the death of a child. I think it's a horrible stereotype, but sometimes there is a connection. I know I felt that way when I lost my daughter. I was kind of feeling like I don't really believe in God, and I don't. But I'm not really sure, and it's not really that big of a deal. But once my daughter was stillborn, it really sort of affirmed for me that there is no God. And Peggy, you talked about this a bit in your presentation to the Compassionate Friends this summer. You said that Jordan's death wasn't the cause of your non-belief, but that there was a connection. And you said, and this is paraphrasing you, of course, that the horse had left the barn, but Jordan's death had closed that barn door. So I'd like to talk about that for a little bit, Peggy. I'd like you to tell us about your experience losing your faith and that connection to your son's death. And then to follow up with Rebecca, I believe you had already lost your faith when you got pregnant with Jude. So I'd like you to talk about that experience.
Okay, well, first of all, I think it's sort of important for me to own the fact that I am the daughter of a Southern Baptist minister. So I grew up, as I like to say, marinated in the Christian faith. And I had continued as an adult to practice that, and I raised my children in the church. And then I would say about 5 years before Jordan's death, I really did start to question things. He didn't want to be confirmed. He chose not to be confirmed in our particular church at the time, which was Episcopalian. And that caused me to say, my goodness, because I thought he's really smart and he really well read and thought through things. And if he wasn't willing to go through that, I was like, wow. And then certainly there were social issues where I sensed a growing separation from the church. issues like on abortion rights, as you mentioned, with the tragedy that's unfolding in Texas and Mississippi from my perspective, as well as I think the church patriarchy was a problem for me. And then I like to consider myself an ally for the LGBTQ community. So there were lots of things that were separating that out. And I was already quite clear that I did not believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible. And I didn't believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. But, I was still, it was so much a part of my life and had been for so long. And I was still kind of, going along. And then Jordan died. I haven't been back to church since Jordan's funeral. And that spent a lot of years really trying to not only cope with the excruciating grief, but also to really look at, what do I believe? What do I think? And I came to realize that, I just always kind of accepted that religious belief as a part of my life. And I had really never applied critical thinking skills. And once I started thinking critically, then that horse left the barn and the barn door got shut. So that, yes, I hope that answers your question, because that really is my journey. And then I would say that within a few years after that, I was really clear that I identified as a non-believer. And then I also was really clear that as much as I was grateful for the help I got from the compassionate friends, there were a lot of people there that assumed you held a specific faith belief. And that, I think it was 2015 is the first time, and Rebecca helped me with this, that I delivered that workshop, Healing When Faith Is Not an Option. And it was just wonderful that they were so supportive of having someone speak to that aspect or that segment of the community, even though it is a minority segment.
And Rebecca, why don't you tell us about your experience?
Well, I was raised a secular Jew, which, for those who don't know about that, means basically I was raised with cultural Judaism, with the holidays, with, language sprinkled with Yiddish and Jewish food, but without any kind of literal belief in God or the Torah. Judaism is not, one is, in terms of American Judaism, is often very supportive of questioning, and also, doesn't have a strong sort of solidified afterlife belief in the first place. When I was in my late teens and 20s, I, being a California girl, kind of picked up some woo beliefs. I had a spiritualism of my own that had kind of a higher power belief. I dabbled in Wicca, all those things that one does if one was not raised strictly Christian. But then in my 30s, by my mid to late 30s, I'm very close, almost lifelong friends with Greta Christina, who at the time was doing a great deal of writing about atheism. And I really started thinking about it and thinking about my own beliefs. And I was like, you know what? I don't have any evidence for any of these beliefs. And that as a grown-up, I think part of what it means to be a grown-up is to not believe things that there's absolutely no proof of. And so I let go of my spirituality. And that's a little hard. I think the hardest thing for me about letting go of spirituality was not being able, I work with youth a lot, and, when you worry about people a lot, it's nice to feel like there's someone else looking out for them and accepting that, that they had to go out into the world with what we taught them, and there wasn't anyone looking over them was kind of a hard thing to accept. when Jude died, well, when Jude was alive, and, we were all had such hopes for him that he could make it because he was a little fighter. He was prayed for in churches. He was prayed for by friends of mine all over the country. The Indian part of my family, there were, prayers to Ganesh. There were prayers in mosques. There were prayers at the Wailing Wall in Israel. Like, if prayers could have saved a baby, they would have saved Jude. And, while I didn't believe that they could save him, it always felt nice to know that people cared and were rooting for him, which was really how I saw it. And then, after he died, it can be really tempting to believe. But whenever I kind of let myself engage in daydreaming about heaven, I would start thinking, well, he's with my grandma and my friends who died of AIDS, who really cared about me and would care about my baby. But then I'd start thinking things like, okay, so do babies grow up in the afterlife, and do they go to school, and are they charter schools or public schools? And, at that point, like, every time I thought about an afterlife for my son, cognitive dissonance would set in, and that's one of the things that I think makes grieving without faith, which is often assumed to be harder than grieving with faith. Cognitive dissonance is not comfortable. And if you take apart the word comfortable, you get like able to be comforted. I think that a lot of people, their grief is made harder by the cognitive dissonance that any rational person has when they're thinking about an afterlife.
Well, I've been incredibly impressed with the community that you've created, Rebecca. I've wanted to do this show for a very long time, partly because of my own experience. And my daughter's death was a pain that I never imagined could exist. And it felt so very isolating, even more so as a non-believer. And I actually remember going to a presentation that Rebecca gave at Free Thought Fest here at the University of Wisconsin a while back, and being so excited to learn that there was a community like Grief Beyond Belief. It was a number of years after my loss, but I was so happy that it existed. She really created a space that I thought was sorely needed. And when Peggy reached out to us and our co-president Annie Laurie Gaylor forwarded it to me, I was so impressed that she was working for acceptance of non-believers at the Compassionate Friends. These are both things that I try to do on a very much smaller scale here in Madison with my local pregnancy and infant loss group, where I was confronted with a lot of religion as well. I was really impressed with Rebecca's presentation because she talked about why she created Grief Beyond Belief. And we actually have a clip from that presentation that kind of talks a little bit about that. So if we'd like to show that.
When you're grieving, grief is like this. You're sort of walking through life, and this hole opens up in front of you. And for a minute, you're Wile E. Coyote. You keep walking, and then you just fall. And so once you're down at the bottom of that hole, the thing is, there's this rope, right, called religion or spirituality, and you can grab it. And if you are able to manage a substantial amount of cognitive dissonance, you can hold on to that rope. But if you're thinking rationally, you slide down that rope pretty quickly, and then you're in that hole. And the common meme says that, in fact, there is no comfort for you at the bottom of that hole if you do not have religion or spirituality. And we are able to have this group where we know that, in fact, if what you are is really angry at religion, or angry at religious people because of what they've said to you in your grief, you're not going to have to worry that you're going to hurt someone's feelings when you express that anger. That's one of the things that having this closed group provides. And so we started really discovering what are the things that help, because that whole thing about there is no comfort when you're down in that hole, if you don't have religion, if you don't have that rope, there's nothing for you. It's not true.
And so, Rebecca, I would just ask, how were you surprised at how quickly Grief Beyond Belief took off?
I was so surprised. Honestly, when I planned this Facebook page, I thought maybe a few dozen people would join, and, we'd all talk about our grief and we'd feel a little better. And within a week, 1,000 people had followed the page. But more importantly, people were engaging. They were posting about their own grief. They were comforting each other. They were sharing stories. And the page really took off and was thousands of people very quickly. And so I had not realized, I knew there was a need, but I had not realized how widespread the need was until I started the group. And then Facebook made all these annoying changes, so it wasn't really possible to have anything interactive. And that was why a couple years later, Nita Grayson and I founded the closed Facebook support group, where people could really interact more. And it's been incredibly powerful. I mean, there are over 6,000 members of that group now. And in terms of Facebook grief support, we're kind of one of the biggies, which is surprising to me. And there are some people who go through the group and it helps them during sort of their crisis of grief, and then they leave and move on. And there are other people who've stayed in the group for years, and what's best is there are people like Peggy and like the, over a dozen volunteers who stick around to help other people. And honestly, the community could not be what it is if there weren't volunteers who were willing to say, this really helped me, and now I want to be here for other people who are where I was when I first joined.
And your group really is the biggie for this community. I know from other atheist and non-believing groups that I'm part of, whenever anybody has a death that they're trying to grieve, Grief Beyond Belief is always the one that's mentioned as a referral. And online support is great. It's there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So, if you are feeling miserable at midnight, there's always usually somebody who is going to respond to your post and engage with you in some way. And so that's great. But I know I also needed that in-person support. I really went for all of the tools, online support, in-person support, books, whatever I could find. And when I did go to these local groups, I often found that I was sort of censoring myself because I wasn't sure where everybody was with regard to religion. And I was really concerned that I didn't want to offend anybody, but, I was also feeling upset about some of the things that were being said there. And so I always found Grief Beyond Belief to be a really safe space for that. And so when I found out what Peggy has been doing with the Compassionate Friends, because in reality there are a lot of those smaller groups that the Compassionate Friends runs around the country, including here in Madison. It is a place that I refer people to go to when they lose their children as well. And there's a quote from Peggy's presentation, Healing When Faith is Not an Option. I believe we have it in a graphic that talks about Oh, sorry, I guess we don't, but I can read it for you. So she said in her presentation, I wish for everyone to find the places that make them feel safe, supported, included, and consoled, while TCF does not very deliberately reach out across society's barriers to all bereaved parents, siblings, and grandparents, respecting everyone's beliefs and espousing no specific religious or philosophical ideology. TCF is a member-driven volunteer organization, and in some communities, culture and religion are so tightly entwined that they are almost inseparable. Some folks struggle to accept that predominantly Christian doesn't mean exclusively Christian. She went on to say, in the United States, atheists and agnostics are in the minority. As free thinkers, we can feel ostracized, marginalized, and alienated, even within the bereavement community. So Peggy, how have your efforts been to kind of foster this conversation at the Compassionate Friends?
Well, I think very much to their credit, this last summer, the national conference, I was asked to give one of the keynote addresses. So typically, I'm talking to my people. I mean, I'm talking to atheists and agnostics and non-believers and free thinkers in my workshops because it's so clear that who the target audience is. But in this situation, I was like, oh my goodness, I now have an opportunity to speak to a much broader community, to the community at large. And so with a lot of help from other people like me and TCF, I found a way, I think, to include that, to deliver a keynote that was intended for an extremely broad audience, but also just to broach the subject that everybody deserves a place at the table. That when you are grieving that intensely, you deserve to be comforted and consoled regardless of what your differences might be. Because, when you lose a child, you have more in common with people than, many other things. And I did just sort of make a plea that people not assume, and not just about religious beliefs, but certainly things like gender identification, sexual orientation, all of those things aren't often visible. So if you just take a position of broad inclusivity, then you're less likely to say things that hurt other people. I also tried to explain that in a short amount of time, that early in my grief, I didn't have the personal resources to speak up for myself when someone said something to me from a religious perspective that was offensive. And I think Rebecca Hensler referred to that thing about that the conventional wisdom is you can't survive this if you don't have religion. And that's not true. It's definitely not true, but people will say it to you. And in the beginning, you can't self-advocate. You just can't. You don't have the resources to do that. And that's another reason why, as Rebecca says, people like me are still hanging around 12 years later, because we know what it is like to not have the resources to speak up for yourself. And you need somebody else to speak up for you.
So, Peggy, you mentioned, in those really early days of grief, you really can't advocate for yourself, and you're confronted with these unfair, untrue ideas that, you can't get through this without religion. Can you just talk a little bit about being in that space? And this is for both of you or either of you. How did you navigate that grief as a non-believer or a agnostic at the time? Just reflecting back in that moment, how did you navigate that, or how do you remember navigating that?
Well, there's sort
That's
of
a
desperation, I think, about trying to survive in those early days, whether you're, and frankly, I have never been convinced that it's that much easier for religious people. I think it's just as desperate a time for them. And you mentioned, I think, it's about reading or going to. Yes, I agree with that. I used every tool I could think of, every tool anybody would give me. I read voraciously. I went to different support groups. I got in contact with people who'd had similar losses. I certainly think that, nature, I'm a huge advocate for pets and the comfort that pets can bring. And that's true whether you're religious or not religious, that being out in nature is somehow kind of a healing thing. What I think religion has sort of going for it is it has ritual and it has community. And when you are a non-believer, it's not that those things are forbidden to you. They are not. Both of those things are available to you, community and ritual, but you might have to create them yourself.
Right. I
love that you said that.
Yes, go ahead, Rebecca.
So I think, first of all, I really love that Peggy said, ritual and community, because I think one of the things that secular communities can do is they are perfectly capable of providing the same kind of community sort of wraparound support for their grieving members as a church community would be able to. And it's part of why I wrote the Secular Grief Support Handbook, was so that communities, secular communities who want to provide that support for their members, have some ideas for how to go about doing that. I think for myself, in those immediate months, my survival, without having to have a faith belief, had a lot to do with something my wife said to me at a time when I was in honestly a very bleak place where I really was feeling like there was, no reason for me to be living. She said, "Rebecca, take care of the children in front of you." And I had a group of, a few hundred sixth graders to look after, and just focusing on that is really what got me through the first months of grief. In the longer term, I think one of the things that is so helpful to remember is that meaning making is an important part of grieving, and that as non-believers, as believers, the meaning of life and death is sort of handed to you on a platter. But as non-believers, we really have to make that meaning for ourselves. And for me, being able to live with losing Jude is not made easy, but made survivable by knowing that Jude's life and death led to grief beyond belief. And now there really are thousands of people, and I hear from people all the time who say, "I don't know how I would have made it through without this group." Well, the group wouldn't exist if Jude hadn't lived. And so, to me, I'm able to find some meaning and peace by knowing that this tiny little baby boy who only lived 90 days had this giant impact on the world. And I find comfort in that. And I think finding ways to make meaning and create ripple effects and, teach the people we know the things we learned from the life and death of our loved ones is a way of learning to live with grief.
I think part of healing is also being able to share those stories about our loved ones. I know a lot of my friends who have suffered the loss of a child or the loss of a parent really like to post about them on social media or donate in memory of their loved one to an organization that they loved or that will help with illnesses or something like that. And that sharing and memorializing in that way is really also healing. One of the questions that I did want to ask is when you're sharing these types of stories, especially on social media, you kind of get an onslaught of comments, people liking your post or commenting on your post. And oftentimes, they'll give you religious platitudes. And I would like to hear how you guys dealt with that, the sort of, God has a plan, he needed another angel, I'm praying for you, and now you have a guardian angel. How do you respond to stuff like that?
Or do you?
I remember in the Compassionate Friends Facebook page when I first joined it, I think one of the things that was most alienating was this, that so much of the comfort was things I didn't believe. I have this vivid memory of another grieving parent who had lost an adult daughter saying to me, well, my daughter really loved babies, so I'm sure she's holding Jude for you in heaven till you get there. And I literally, all I could think was, lady, do you understand the infant mortality rate? The odds that your daughter, even if this idea was true, the odds that your daughter would be holding my baby are infinitesimal. And I couldn't say that to her. She was trying to help. Yeah. She was saying the most comforting thing she could think of. And that was one of the steps towards creating Grief Beyond Belief, were these moments where either it was someone offering me comfort that wasn't comforting, or seeking comfort I couldn't offer. Like when people would say, oh, I saw a butterfly in the trunk of my car, and I know it was a sign from my son, and don't you all think it was a sign from my son? And there'd be this flood of yes, of course, yes, of course. And it wasn't something I could participate in because she wasn't asking an honest question. If I had said, no, I think that that's silly, if you had seen anything in the trunk of, if you seen a ladybug, that would have been a sign too. That's your brain doing something to comfort you. But that wasn't what she wanted to hear. And so I did spend a lot of time kind of, I'm going to be honest, holding my tongue and wishing for a place that I didn't have to. And after a year of wishing, I created a place I didn't have to.
I always find, having gone through grief, I try to focus on because so often when you yourself are grieving, and I find this as an atheist, they want to comfort you, but they're saying the thing that is comforting to them. Because of course, in some capacity, they're grieving or dealing with your loss too. And so they're saying the thing that's comforting to them, not the thing that they necessarily think will be comforting to you. And so as a support person to people who I know are grieving in my life, I really try to think about what I can say that is true to myself, but will also be comforting to the grieving person. And same for social media comments. I think that's really important to think about. I found a lot of people didn't really think through what would be comforting to me or my siblings when we were going through the loss of our mom.
I think you're making a good point. Go ahead, Peggy.
I was just going to say, I think that one of the things that I have learned is that we are so ill-prepared in our culture to deal with grief and loss. And it's really not so much about what you say to the grieving, suffering person. It's really about presence.
Right.
And it's really about listening without judgment, and it's less about the words that come out of your mouth beyond "I'm so sorry."
Right.
Well, we are nearing 45 minutes with you, lovely ladies, and I apologize that we're going to have to start taking questions from the audience and starting to wrap up. I feel like we could talk about this for a very long time. We should probably have a part 2 segment of this conversation. So I'm going to go to the questions that were submitted in the Facebook comments and to our email. The first one is actually a comment. Guillermo comments, I am so loving this show with so many women. It's refreshing to see an atheist space not dominated by the male voice.
Hear, hear.
Yes.
Hear, hear.
Mariah Lynn asks, my daughter is 4 years old and my father has been sick with cancer recently. How would you recommend I discuss the topic of death with her in a way that she will understand?
It's so hard. And in fact, I actually wrote a chapter for Parenting Beyond Belief, the second edition of it specifically about this, and it was mostly advice from parents in Grief Beyond Belief. I think the most essential is being honest and straightforward and answering the questions they ask, because developmental stage matters so much for anything like this. And so really listening to your child and hearing what they're capable of understanding, and then sharing as much truth with them as you can. People often think that it helps kids to make things up, and it actually turns out that most of the things that you could make up about death to tell a child are more frightening than the truth to the kid.
Right. I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I say this all the time around here as a parent, which is death and dying are like the only times in my parenting life so far when I am so close to wanting to give in and just say, it's heaven and you'll be with Grammy again. I mean, it is so unbelievably hard to look at your 4-year-old who's confused and sad that their Grammy is gone, and to really level with them all the way through that conversation. It's so unbelievably hard, but that's what we did after my mom's death. And, it can lead to same thing adults feel, the unfathomableness that, are you going to die, Mommy? And am I going to die? And it's as hard for kids to wrap their heads around as adults, but, and some fear and upset feelings about that. But I do think in the end, in the long view, it's been better and easier to cope with the long term, because of course, Grammy will come up forever, and they'll only grow more confused as their critical thinking skills develop. And so it's always been worth it, but so incredibly hard I get why parents lie or use religion themselves to cope through these conversations, because it's just hard.
Absolutely. And children have a tendency then to also ask more questions, like you mentioned, like, well, what else is going to happen? But then as they're processing and trying to understand, they'll come back to you sometimes a couple of days later and bring it up again, which can also be hard when you're grieving yourself to have these conversations over and over again. But just being straightforward about what's happening and honest, I think is always the best advice. And also to be true to your own emotions and let them know I'm sad too, and this is hard too.
Right.
To normalize that feeling for them, I think is important.
And I think the truth of it helped my kids understand or accept what Mommy was going through and feeling, that we're not, telling them we're going to see Grammy again someday, but Mommy can't get out of bed because she's crying and she's so sad and she misses Grammy. I think it really helped the whole family process death on the same terms.
So another question is, what resources are available for the grieving non-believer?
Well, Rebecca's workbook and Greta Christina's book, that's two.
So there are some great books. Go ahead.
I'm a huge fan of Megan Devine, and I don't know what her specific religious views are, but it seems to me that her work is always quite secularly oriented. And her book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, is one of my favorites.
Yeah. And then also, Rebecca Hensler, you have the Bill of Rights for the Grieving Non-Believer, which is available at the Facebook page and the website. You should check it out. There's some wonderful advice there for being an atheist and grieving. I do want to end with a really great comment from Heather Johnson. She writes, in the past year or so, I lost my paternal grandmother, a dear friend, and my foster dad and others. All the religion really got to me. Until I found Grief Beyond Belief, I was feeling so isolated and alone in my grief. Just having people who understand is such a comfort, not having to worry about triggering comments about faith and prayers and all the other religious nonsense is wonderful. So thank you both for your work. That's it for this week's Ask an Atheist.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much, and thank you, Peggy.
Good to see you, Rebecca.
Yeah. So we have a clip because we also want to acknowledge this week that we lost our dear friend Ed Asner. He visited Free Thought Hall and was a guest on Free Thought Matters. And so we'll show you a small clip of Ed visiting our offices.
Max Welton's braes are bonny, where early falls the dew, and 'twas there that Annie Laurie gave me her promise true, gave me a promise true, which ne'er forgot will be, and for bonny Annie Laurie I'd lay me down and die.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
Okay, but she's already married, you know. She's
Get your hands off her.
So that's Ed Asner serenading Annie Laurie with the song that she was named after on Free Thought Matters, which is FFRF's TV program. It's coming back this week, Sunday. Catch it on TV stations, on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for tuning in to Ask an Atheist. Join us next week, same time, same place.
Freedom from religion.